In 1959, the Cuban Revolution ended, and as leader of the revolution, Fidel Castro took charge of Cuba. The CIA saw Castro as a communist and as a threat, and they wanted to overthrow him. The CIA asked President Kennedy to give them permission to take out Castro, and Kennedy allowed them. They planned an attack on Cuba to take out Castro, but sadly their plan had failed. Because of the failed mission, America had to give Cuba $52 million worth of food and medicine. Kennedy also took the responsibility for the failed invasion, and that severely damaged his credibility. If the invasion had never happened, Cuba wouldn't have become stronger, and America wouldn't have had to pay a lot of money in food and medicine to Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis would have never happened, and America would have never been embarrassed for the biggest failure in history. In 1952, there was an election for president in Cuba. Fidel Castro was winning the election at the time, and everybody knew he was going to win. On the other hand, Fulgencio Batista was losing the election, and he decided to take over Cuba without winning the election and by using force. After Batista became the dictator of Cuba, Castro and other Cuban citizens were angry at him for taking over, and they decided to start a revolution against Batista. The revolution started in 1952 and ended 6 years later. On 1959, Cuba had won the revolution against Batista, and since Castro had led the revolution, became the new dictator of Cuba. After the whole revolution in Cuba, the CIA and the US saw Castro as a communist and as a threat. The CIA wanted to get rid of Castro. They had planned to shoot Castro, poison him, and other ways to kill him. In the end, they decided to attack Cuba. The CIA had asked President Eisenhower and President Kennedy for the permission to take out the plan and overthrow Castro. Both presidents gave permission to do so. The CIA needed people for the plan. They later found out that there had been Cubans migrating from Cuba and had gone to Florida. They knew that these Cuban exiles disliked Castro and they would be perfect for an attack. They gathered 1,400 Cuban exiles. So the CIA needed to train the exiles, and they decided to send them to training camps in Nicaragua. After a couple of months of training, the exiles were ready for the attack on Cuba. The CIA wanted the attack to look like another revolution in Cuba and not an attack by America. They decided to damage Cuba's air force and weaken Cuba by using a fake attack. On April 15, 1961, America sent out 8 bomber planes that had Cuban markings that were made to look like Cuban planes to attack Cuba's air force, to weaken Cuba for the upcoming invasion, and to create a thought that some Cubans were starting a new revolution. 1 plane was shot down, leaving 7 planes, but then another plane was sent from Nicaragua to attack Cuba, and then to pretend to attack America. On April 16, 1961, the CIA sent out boats with very large speakers to buy a Honda to create a fake attack on Cuba. On April 17, 1961, the Cuban exiles left Nicaragua and sailed to Cuba with ammunition, food, and other supplies. Once they had arrived, they were informed that the plan had completely changed and they were just going to attack Cuba. Some port workers from Nicaragua informed the Cuban government that the invaders were going to attack Cuba. The Cuban Air Force later found the invaders' landing site and bombed the exile ships, destroying some of them and making the rest retreat. The exiles were left with the ammunition and supplies they were carrying. The exiles had to survive with the supplies they only had. They also had to fight back the Cuban soldiers that were attacking them. The fight lasted for 3 days between the exiles and the soldiers. The exiles were protected by B-25s and B-23s for a while, but they had to fly to Nicaragua and back to Cuba to fuel up. In the process of doing that, they had to remove their tail gun, which made them vulnerable to Cuban guns. Most of the planes were shot down, leaving the exiles vulnerable. There was also a group of underground exiles that were supposed to blow up bridges, highways, and roads that led to the Bay of Pigs, but they were most likely captured by the Cuban soldiers. Since the underground group had failed to complete their mission, Cuban forces could easily enter the Bay of Pigs and attack the exiles. The exiles struggled to make their way inland, and after 3 days they ran out of ammunition and all their supplies. They had no choice but to retreat. After a while, they knew they were not going to be rescued, and they planned to separate and try to escape Cuba. The main plan was to get to the mountains or just somehow get out of Cuba and into America, but the exiles failed to do so because they were surrounded by swamps which slowed them down. At that point, the only way of reversing the whole failing operation was for America to send in Marines and air support. The CIA asked for Kennedy's permission to send backup, but Kennedy refused. In the end, over 1,000 exiles were captured and over 100 died. The captured exiles were transported to a sporting stadium in Havana and they were processed. The exiles spent 18 months in jail. Castro interrogated some of the exiles and violated some of the exiles' rights. After 18 months in prison, the exiles were sent back to America in exchange for $52 million worth of food and medicine. Once the exiles returned to America, many of the CIA operatives and administrators like Allen Welsh Deuce that were in charge of the invasion were assigned or fired. Later, there was a discussion on who was responsible for the whole invasion. The CIA and the Cuban exiles blamed JFK for the failed invasion. They said that he did not help with the planning of the invasion and never sent backup to help the exiles. Then JFK blamed the CIA, saying that they did not give him every detail of the invasion and they gave him misleading information. In the end, JFK took the responsibility for the invasion, which severely damaged his credibility. Later, Castro allowed the exiles and anybody else involved with the invasion to enter Cuba. He also made speeches about Cuba's victory against America. He later made an alliance with the Soviet Union because he wanted to have another country help him if Cuba was attacked again. Cuba's new alliance with the Soviet Union led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened after the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was one of America's biggest failures. It will be remembered in America and Cuba's history. People say it failed because of bad planning, unexpected situations, and many other reasons. We still do not have every single detail on what happened that made the invasion fail, because the CIA still has not released it for the public. Let's just hope the CIA in America does not have another humiliating fiasco that will stay forever in our history.